Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll be going over the history and geography of France, La Belle France. I guess that's a good time to note that I will be using all of the American pronunciations in France because one, I'm American, and two, you don't want to hear my French accent all throughout this video. I'm so excited for this country. It's one of the few countries that I've actually traveled to and experienced and love. It was an adventure. I've talked about it on live streams a few times. It was at the time a horrible trip, but looking back it was so much fun. So anyway, let's talk about the borders of France. We'll go over its long history and then we'll flip through this incredible book. So, France has a lot of countries bordering it actually. There you go. We have a border with Belgium up here, a little border with Luxembourg. It's a little country, little border. We have a border with Germany and Switzerland, all the way down here. And this border with Italy. And don't forget, we have Monaco down here. We have this border with Spain as well. And don't forget, we have a border with Andorra as well. Now, this part of France that you see here is called Metropolitan France. It also includes Corsica down here. Don't forget Corsica. So Metropolitan France is located within Western Europe. There's a lot more to France. They have a lot of overseas regions and departments, special areas that belong to France. We have French Guiana over in South America, and if you come to my Monday night trivias, I saw a trivia question in a book coming up that said, what's France's longest border? Like, what country does France have the longest border with? The answer is Brazil, because of French Guiana. Remember that. So French Guiana in the Caribbean, there's Guadeloupe and Martinique. In the Indian Ocean, there's Mayotte and Réunion. And then the areas with a more special status, they have a bit more of a say in their governments. There's over by Canada, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. In the Caribbean, there's Saint-Martin, which they share with the Netherlands, and Saint-Barthélemy. Over in the Pacific is French Polynesia. That's where you'll find Tahiti, Bora Bora, all those magnificent, beautiful vacation islands. Also New Caledonia. There's Wallis and Futuna as well. And lots of other uninhabited islands throughout the Pacific. And they even have a part of Antarctica called Adelie Land, which I love Adelie penguins. There's a book of Adelie penguins in here, and I almost cried because I love penguins, especially Adelie penguins. They're so cute anyway. So, that's the political areas of France. Let's talk a bit about the historical ones, because they're just as important. There's a few that you have heard of. I want to point out mainly the ones that most people would know. So let me slide this around. Over here you'll see Brittany, this section here. And you might be thinking Brittany, isn't that like Britain, which is just up here? We'll talk about that in history. Up here you can see Normandy all along the coast here. There's the city of Le Havre, which is on the end of the Seine River. Also, just a note up here, there's Calais, which connects to England via the English Channel Tunnel that goes across the English Channel, making a link to England. So, coming down the Seine, we reach Ile-de-France, where we have Paris. Paris, the capital city, and absolutely gorgeous place. It's such a lovely city. And let's see, what other ones should you know? There's Burgundy. Everyone knows Champagne, famous obviously for the drink. Let's see, we also have, let's go down south. We have the Camargue has come up every time I've researched French geography. They've mentioned this specifically because there's wild horses there and they run across the beach and they're beautiful. Literally mentioned in every France research I've done, they're like, and in Camargue, you can find wild horses. Like, okay, I get it. There's also Provence down here where you can find Aix-en-Provence, and cities like Marseille and Cannes, where the film festival is, and beautiful Nice. This area is the French Riviera on the Mediterranean Sea. This is where we have luxurious beaches and luxurious everything. This is the vacation spot for French people and people around the world. Honestly, it's a very, very beautiful, beautiful place. France also has lots of interesting geographic features. Down here in the south, there are some really fantastic mountains. We have the Pyrenees that make up the border with Spain. And over here, the borders of Switzerland and Italy are the Alps, the beginnings of the Alps mountains that curve across much of Europe. Here we can find the highest point of Mont Blanc. Let me bring it a little closer so I can see. There's lots of mountains here. There he is. Mont Blanc's the highest point in France and the highest point in the Alps. There's also the Massif Central, which is a very, I guess, mountainy, very hilly, very rocky area. It's very interesting. I don't know how else to describe it. There's places where there's just like rocks sticking out of the ground randomly among the hills. It's really beautiful, but very distinct. The rest of France is covered in beautiful rivers and countryside, all lush and green. I mentioned the Seine River. We also have the Rhone River coming down here. The Rhine makes up part of the border with Germany. And the Loire River, you can see, comes through Tours and Nantes out into the Atlantic Ocean. There's so many others to mention. I'm not going to point them all out. It's a bit too long. But in a nutshell, that's about it for geography of France. I don't know if I'm just like nervous and excited or if there was a tiny earthquake. Because I felt a shaky shake around this desk. I don't know if it was me being excited. It probably was. Let's get into its history because that's what I'm really excited about. Put you back. And let's get into it. So the first people would have entered France about 1.8 million years ago. And there is some incredible evidence of the prehistoric peoples and the things they left behind. In particular, the caves of Lascaux, the most beautiful cave art in the world. Although I think the cave art in Hargeisa, Somaliland, is my favorite. But there's something very special about Lascaux and how absolutely beautifully preserved that artwork is. I'll post a video about Lascaux up there that I've already done. There's also the Karnak Stones, which I love because I am a stone circle ancient monolith nerd. The Karnak Stones are remarkable in that they are hundreds of rocks stuck into the ground in lines that looks like a very well-planned forest of stones, and lots of mysteries about that, as you can imagine. It's really spectacular. In 600 BCE, the Greeks came up and founded a city here in what's now Marseille. That was the very first settlement in France. But most of France, especially all up here, was dominated by Celtic tribes. Lots of very different Celtic tribes, all with very unique, distinct cultures. Some of them, though, attacked Rome once Rome became a thing in history. They were very violent, and it got to the point where Rome got tired. They started to creep in. They formed a province down here, hence the name, Provence. And Julius Caesar himself made his way up what they referred to as Gaul to attack the Celtic tribes, with the most famous being the defeat of Vercingetorix in 52 BCE. And I'll leave a video up there about that really interesting battle of attrition that Julius Caesar waged. Eventually, the Romans would take over all of what's now France and then some. And they built beautiful buildings and structures and brought in their culture, language. France is a Romance language, meaning it came from the Romans. The most famous and best preserved Roman structure is the Pandugao Aqueduct, which of course there's a picture in here I'll show you. It's so remarkable. It looks like it was just built. It wasn't. But in the 200 CE, various barbarian tribes started to invade and take over the Roman territories. I'm excited, can you tell? I'm talking too fast. There were the Burgundians, which is how we get Burgundy. There were the Britons from up there that settled in this area, and that's why it's called Brittany, because the Britons came in and took over this area. And there were the Franks, which is how we get the word France. It came from the Franks and the Frankish kings. The first Frankish king was named Clovis the First. He began to rule in 481. He converted to Catholicism, which France is still a majority Catholic country today. It'll come up a lot in its history, just wait. But the most famous of the Frankish kings from the Carolingian dynasty was Charlemagne, or Charlemagne. King Charlemagne began his rule of the Franks in 768, and in the year 800 he had grown so powerful, his empire so fast, that the Pope officially named him the Holy Roman Emperor, and thus was the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a bit too big to last, and after Charlemagne died and succession had to be passed down, eventually, after a lot of fighting and violent negotiations, let's put it that way, 3 of Charlemagne's grandsons divided up the territory, and this area today was known as West Francia. So, rule began of this area. There were some Viking attacks, some very brutal ones that came in down from over here. A very famous attack on Paris, and they sailed down the Seine. And they were Norsemen, or Northmen, or Normans. And that's why we have Normandy. I love etymologies of places, if you can't tell. Also, flash forward a bit into history were the Crusades, a big important era of France where many knights and soldiers and kings and nobles went over to the Holy Land to try to reclaim it from the Muslims. It was the majority French people from Europe who fought in the Crusades over there. But what's most important about this era to point out was the beginnings of feudalism and the implementation of that. Feudalism is when the peasants work 100% for the lords who owned the land. They got to live rent-free on the land, but all of the food that they harvested went to the lords 100%, and the lords would redistribute what they felt that they had earned back. So even though they didn't really have to pay kind of well, there were taxes, let's put it that way. They did have to pay taxes on things, but they got to live on the land and give away all of their food. So, not the best system, but it worked out for the people at the top, so it remained for a long time. Let's talk about the 100 Years' War, where the line of kings died out, and they had to go through like the family lineage to figure out who would be the next king of France. If they had gone through the female line, it would have been the King of England. You can tell I'm generalizing. I don't want to get too specific in this video. We're just generalizing, so don't worry about the details right now. The King of England would have been the rightful ruler of France. So he tried to claim what he believed would be rightfully his territory. England and France had been at odds for quite a while. I mean, this happened, right? But this is when it really became a full-on feud. I mean, it was a huge war. The British were on top for the longest time until the French people were rallied by a very young girl named Joan of Arc, who led an army in a battle and sacrificed herself after she was captured. And that led to the inspirational return of the French army. And France would eventually win the Hundred Years' War and retain their kingdom. They did not get absorbed into England, even though England has tried so many times throughout history. They would keep coming back and trying, and they would never fully make it. The French Renaissance begins in the 15th century, and my goodness, the explosion of culture in this country was remarkable, especially I think in terms of architecture. Absolutely gorgeous palaces, like fairy tale princess castles you can imagine, especially within the Loire Valley. And there was just like a big embrace of religion at this time and religious art. And that led to a lot of disdain for the Protestants. Once the Protestant Reformation started to enter France, the Protestants of France were known as the Huguenots. And the Catholic rulers of France weren't happy about them. And in 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre occurred, where so many Huguenots were just slaughtered in the streets. It was a horrific event. The outrage of it would eventually lead to the Edict of Nantes, which would guarantee, in a sense, the right to worship whatever branch of Christianity you chose. It wasn't so much freedom of religion as tolerance of religion to a point, right? So that was a very important thing in history. Let's head over to the 1600s. A man named Cardinal Richelieu worked with the king to implement so many different shady events, and I don't want to get into Cardinal Richelieu. He was a character, man. He did so much behind the scenes work to ensure that the king would slowly have more and more power over the country, to the point where the king would eventually become an absolute monarch and have complete control over France and its church and all of the peasants and lords. Probably like the most famous, not infamous, but famous king was Louis XIV. He built this beautiful castle at Versailles. I picked these nails because they reminded me of the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. But it was the most luxurious castle to have ever been built, probably ever, honestly, even to this day. And he invited all of the different lords and nobles across the country to live there. So how could you not want to live in the most luxurious palace ever built, right? Even though it had no bathrooms, no toilets. I should say that. No water closets anywhere. But every single important person of note lived in the same castle, under the same roof, so the king could oversee all of them. He was known as the Sun King because he really loved art and theater and beautiful architecture and beautiful landscaped gardens and things like that. Eventually, though, let me mention real quick that obviously when all the nobles are living in one place, they become quite ignorant into what's happening in the rest of France, and that the peasants were starving, the crops weren't doing too well. The Huguenots had a lot of their rights taken away. The Edict of Nantes was destroyed, so a lot of Huguenots had to flee or suffer the consequences. And it's around this time that the Enlightenment began, which was a period of a concept of the rights of man, kind of what we consider common sense today, like everyone's equal, nature is important, we should all just get along, things like that. It was very revolutionary for the time because nothing had ever been proposed like that. And a lot of peasants in France thought that that was a pretty great idea. In 1756, the 7 Years' War begins between France and Britain, of course, because they disagreed over territory in North America. Oh, I forgot to mention, during the Renaissance era, all of the colonial areas they scooped up in what's now Canada and the United States today across the ocean. That's kind of important. I feel bad I left that out, but now we know. Britain, of course, had a chunk of its own in what's now the United States. They wanted more of Canada. They fought over it until 1763. The British would eventually, I wouldn't say they won, but they definitely came out on top, let's say. The American Revolution would spark up not long after that, and France, wanting revenge, they would do anything to get back at Britain, helped pay for the revolution, which would become a success, but France would wind up basically bankrupt after all of this war and fighting that they had participated in. So, the king at the time, Louis XVI, in 1789, a very important year in France's history, summoned the Estates General. So there were three main estates or groups of people in France. Number one would have been the nobility. Number two was the church. And number three was everyone else, basically the lower class, the peasant class. He brought leaders from each estate together to try to figure out what to do about the financial situation. And of course, estates 1 and 2 were like, oh, money and wealth is so important. We have to figure out how to keep our wallets full and our pockets full and all of our magnificent feasts on the table. And the third estate goes, well, our people are starving in their huts. Can we do something about that? And the rest agreed to disagree. So the leaders of the third estate had had enough. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. And they formed the National Assembly, their own government that was poised to take over the country, and they did, beginning on July 14th of that year. In Paris, they stormed the Bastille prison, liberating it, and that sparked the French Revolution, which ran rampant across the country, overthrowing every kind of corrupt political or church power that there was. It led to an era known as the Reign of Terror. This is when the guillotines would come out, and they would guillotine pretty much anyone who held any kind of power in the country, including the king and his queen, Marie Antoinette. It was a bad time, you guys. It was very scary. It was sort of almost like a witch hunt, in that if you said the wrong thing, if you dressed the wrong way, if you looked a little too frou-frou, fancy, you were done. So it was a very scary time. There was lots of internal conflict. There was lots of external conflict of countries, not just trying to help out their friends in France, but, they could also take over if they could, but they never did. And eventually a general would step up and say, listen, there's too much conflict. I'm going to unite everyone. I'm going to repair everything, and I'm going to bring this country back together. And everyone was very excited about that. So in 1799, General Napoleon Bonaparte took over the country, and he would eventually name himself Emperor of France. If you thought the kings were bad, here comes the emperor, right? He really kind of saw himself as a Caesar kind of figure. And he ran rampant across the rest of Europe. Europe tried to fight back to keep him from invading, but he was unstoppable. He won battle after battle. He was a brilliant military strategist. And it wasn't until he attempted to invade Russia in the winter and his Grand Armée starved and froze, and he had to retreat. That was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. He was eventually defeated, exiled, and he managed to escape exile, come back to France. The French were ecstatic. They started up Napoleon Part 2, the sequel, and it didn't last long. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was defeated. He was crushed in battle, the naval battle. Very famous Battle of Waterloo. How does it feel that you won the war, Battle of Waterloo? Let me turn over my notes real quick. I leave this in because it's a really tingly notebook right now. Really crinkly, I think. I love page sounds. So, Napoleon was officially exiled down into St. Helena, far in the Atlantic Ocean, where he would remain forever. It's kind of hard to escape from that kind of island. Following the age of Napoleon, with France trying to pull itself back together after all of that mess, a lot happened that is kind of difficult to sum up. They attempted to bring back the monarchy. That didn't work out. they began to wage a war with Algeria, which they wound up taking over the country, much to the chagrin of the Algerians. And it was a fairly politically chaotic era. Eventually, they would elect a president, Napoleon's nephew, who would declare himself emperor, Napoleon III, and would attempt to do what his relative had done, but was unseated after a very unsuccessful war with Prussia. And France was like, okay, we've tried everything. Let's just try democracy. It seems to be working with our friends over in America. Let's just try out democracy. And it flourished. And France entered an area known as the Belle Epoch, the beautiful times, where we see a lot of the French identity that is around today in terms of architecture, art, culture, food. The Eiffel Tower was built. Many of the iconic French buildings were built at this time. They invented movies, which is very important to me. The Lumiere Brothers invented motion picture, because I love movies, you guys. If you think geography is my big passion, it's actually movies. So geography comes in at number 2. I love film, you guys. So it was a beautiful, beautiful time to be in France, until it wasn't. In 1914, they were invaded by Germany in World War I, and France was ravaged, you guys. It was a battleground known as the Western Front. If you've seen the movie 1917, which is remarkable and also very traumatic, it's a British movie about British soldiers, but they're fighting in France, and you can really see just how the countryside was obliterated throughout much of the country. It was a horrendous time for France, but France would end up winning the war. So they began to pull themselves back together and rebuild and restore their identity. And then in 1940, they were invaded again by Germany. The Nazis invaded France very quickly, took over Paris and the rest of the country. Most of the nobles fled to the town of Vichy, you can see right here, and that's where the new government was set up from. It was a puppet state by the Nazi Germans. The actual leaders of Free France, they were known, operated out of the UK, led by General Charles de Gaulle. He would help orchestrate the Normandy landing on June 4th, 1944, which would begin the invasion force that would eventually win the western half of the European half of World War II. France once again had to pull itself up by the bootstraps. There were some wars of independence in their territories, mainly in French Indochina, and a big one in Algeria that was very costly to the country, but Algeria won its independence in the end. Eventually, France would be a very important member, and still is today, of the United Nations. They are a superpower within the General Assembly. They are a very important proponent of the European Union. They're the largest country in the EU. They are part of the Eurozone, which means they use the euro as their currency. And immigration has really ramped up, especially after the war with Algeria and the dust settling from all of the various wars of the 20th century, many people coming into the country. It's a very diverse country nowadays. There has been some issues of anti-Muslim laws outlawing head coverings. They say that they outlaw, like in public schools, you can't wear any like crosses or skull caps for Jewish children or head coverings for Muslim children, but you know, it's become more like, oh, you can't wear it on the beach, and it apparently is separation of church and state thing, but it just seems like an anti-Muslim thing to me. There have been some very terrifyingly horrific terrorist attacks in France that I don't want to get into because they're very depressing, and I don't think YouTube would like it. I would very much like it if this video does not get demonetized because of them, so just take note that there were some really horrendous attacks throughout France's history in the 2000s and 2010s. But in a nutshell, that is where we are today in France. One of the most beautiful countries. I know I've mentioned it a lot in the live stream, but I went to France in the summer of 2003. One of the I say now, one of the hottest summers on record, because this past summer, 2022, is now the hottest summer on record. It was miserable. It was hot. There was a strike happening, which happens a lot in France. There's always a strike happening somewhere in the country. But it was a garbage strike. So there was trash and garbage all throughout the streets in the hot day with no relief of any kind from the heat. And I went on Bastille Day. The train stopped running earlier than usual. So we were trapped at the Eiffel Tower, where we saw the most beautiful fireworks, but then we had to walk back to our hotel. It took 4 hours in the middle of the night. It was still incredibly hot in the middle of the night. We were still sweating, even though it was like midnight. But I'm glad I went. Being in France on Bastille Day was a bucket list thing for me that I've got to cross off. There's not a lot of bucket list things that I've been able to cross off, so that was very important. I stood right about here and watched the fireworks in Bastille Day, and that was something I had always dreamed of doing in my young life. I was 18, it was 2003, so that was very wonderful. Let's take a look at some pictures of France. The beautiful countryside here, so rustic and beautiful. This opening chapter here talks about Joan of Arc mainly, so here she is riding through town looking very gallant and heroic. Political map of France. King Charles VII, who was king during Joan of Arc's time. And she was eventually captured by the British and burned at the stake as a heretic, because the whole reason that she rose up was due to her having visions from angels and hearing voices from angels telling her to fight for France. Nowadays she's canonized as a saint, so she's a very beloved figure in French history. Oh, I need to move this. That's going to roll off. There we go. Here's a reenactment of Joan riding through the town, all gallant and chivalrous. And there's Francois Hollande, president in 2012, which, let me see when this book came out. Let's see if he was president when this book came out, because this book is old, but not too old. 2013, so yeah. Anyway, moving on. The absolutely beautiful countryside. You could see why, like, wine and cheese and various other things, very pastoral products, are made in France, because it's that kind of environment. There's a physical map here. A gorgeous coastline there. That's definitely the Riviera. That's not Atlantic waters. And the big, big Alps mountains. Here's the Mediterranean coast again. The Rhone River flowing through Lyon. Here's another picture of Lyon. Beautiful city. And this is Toulouse up here, the pink city it's called. So apparently this is pink. Okay. Here's the Adelie penguin. Isn't it cute? Oh my gosh. I like them because if I asked someone draw a picture of a penguin, it would be like black, white, cute. Adelie penguins are so cute. This is on Corsica. Very, very beautiful architecture here. I didn't talk about geography of Corsica, but that'll be on another day. A very rainy day here. Got their umbrellas on. And the Riviera paradise. See, look. I'm not kidding when I said deadly heat. Look how many people passed away because of complications from the heat. It was bad, you guys. Beautiful. This is also the Alps. Stunning, stunning, stunning. The Canal du Midi. A very lovely waterway, man-made to make it very, very beautiful near Toulouse. Fields of lavender. Isn't that so gorgeous? And here are some beautiful irises, the national flower, which is where France gets the fleur-de-lis design from. Giverny, where Monet lived and painted his beautiful water lily themed art. There's a big ol' ibex there, big ol' horns up in the mountains. The national animal is the Gallic Rooster, which is really cool. My landlady has a Gallic Rooster. It's just a little different, but it looks like that. It says cock-a-doodle-doo. Here's the horses running across the Karnak. Every source I read, the book I'm going to read to you tomorrow also has a picture of the horses of the Karnak running wild and free. This is Zafar the giraffe, who was a gift from Egypt. And Zafar walked up France to Paris, where she got to live in a garden the rest of her life, and she was like a sensation. Because, you know, people hadn't seen giraffes before. The big old bull here in Lascaux Cave. It's so remarkable. It's so wild to think that, like, a human took some, you know, resin of some kind and created this. Like, remarkable. Oh, this is Vercingetorix and Julius Caesar. I guess I'm saying his name wrong, but I don't care because I like how it's pronounced. Is that bad of me? Anyway, here's the Pandugao, which, like I said, looks remarkably well preserved. So neat, built in the 1st century CE. The empires of Clovis and Charlemagne, you can see just how much they expanded there past modern day France. This is part of the Bayeux Tapestry, a very important tapestry. I would say a document, but it's not. It's an artwork. Very important to France and British history because it depicts the Battle of Hastings, where the Normans invaded England. Not this map. This map was way before the Battle of Normandy. Battle of Normandy. Wrong war. The Battle of Hastings. Anyway, I'm going to stop now. This is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. A very tragic event. Can't stress that enough. It was horrendous. Here is Louis XIV in all of his splendor. And here's the Hall of Mirrors that I based my nails on. Here's Voltaire, a very prominent Enlightenment satirical author. This is the Estates General. As you can see, it did not go well. It was pretty hectic, and it led to this, the storming of the Bastille prison. There's Queen Marie Antoinette, and that's what happened to Queen Marie Antoinette at the guillotine. Napoleon's empire. So yeah, all the green were the people fighting against him, and all the pink was what he managed to conquer, and these are his allies. So yeah, he did pretty good for himself, and then he went into Russia. There he is on the battlefield. This is during the Belle Epoque era. You can tell, not just like the picture here, but the actual painting itself. You can tell just from the artwork. Famous author from this time, Émile Zola. And this is during World War I. Not a great picture. You can't really see what's going on, but that was the view for most soldiers down in the trenches. This is during the Great Depression and Unemployment March. France in World War II. So you can see Vichy France was down here. Up this was all controlled by Germany. And you can see the Normandy invasion happened here, and they went all through and took back the country. Here are some French resistance fighters. And there's Charles de Gaulle. He would later become president as well. This is in Algeria during that war. And this is a student protest. Lots of protests all throughout France. This one looks pretty rough, though. The National Assembly building at the Palais Bourbon en Paris. Let's see. Prime Minister of France in 2012, Jean-Marc Ayrault. I've never heard of him, actually. The City of Light. Beautiful, beautiful Paris. So here's a map. You can see there's Notre Dame Cathedral. We've got the Arc de Triomphe down the Champs-Élysées. There's the big obelisk. And, my goodness. I'm trying to remember, like, the path we had to take because we wound up walking past. There's the Eiffel Tower. We wound up having to go, my gosh, all the way up to here because we were near Montmartre. So yeah, it was a hectic walk. There's the beautiful Eiffel Tower itself. When it was built, it was the tallest structure in the world, and it was built for the World's Fair. People thought it was horrendously ugly, but now it's a symbol of romance and beauty. There's the Senate meeting. People lining up to vote, and people supporting François Hollande in 2012. The Massacre about the national anthem. This was during 1792, during the French Revolution. The song was written. And here's the French flag. Let me grab a pencil and let's dissect the flag. The flag of France consists of 3 vertical bands, blue on the left, white in the middle, and red on the right. The flag traces its origins to the French Revolution. During that conflict, the hats of Paris militiamen were adorned with cockades, round decorations made of ribbons. The ribbons were blue and red, colors that appeared on the coat of arms of Paris. In 1789, cockades of blue, white, and red became part of the official uniforms of the National Guard, the new French police force. White had long been associated with France, and in the past had been the dominant color on its flags. The next year, a tricolor flag inspired by these cockades became an official symbol of France, and in 1794 it became the official national flag. Here's all of the regions of France. There's France, Metropolitan France, and their various colonies. Not the Pacific ones for whatever reason. This map doesn't show that. He's cutting the big cheese. Yum yum. A resources map, you can see just how many resources can be found throughout France. It's a lot, including these big old beautiful grapes here to make wine. They have a big automotive industry and a big parfumerie industry. Lots of beautiful perfumes made in France. Here comes the Eurostar train. This is how I got to Paris, on this train. And there's some shipping happening. They use the euro as their currency. Oh, this is a very French picture. Let's take a moment to soak this in. We've got monsieur with his dog, wearing his beret, cozy by the fire in his little cottage, enjoying the day with his companion. That's a really sweet photo. That could be a painting. Here's a population map. You can see it's pretty scattered, but it's really centered around many of the big cities there. Very traditional Basque dance. So the Basque region is down here. It's part of Spain and France. It's very, very distinct, as you can tell. Let's see, a Vietnamese cook here, because France used to own Vietnam, so there's a lot of Vietnamese in France. Marine Le Pen, we're not going to talk about her because we don't discuss people like her on this channel. People getting arrested during a riot, and reading the newspaper about Obama opens new era of financial regulation. Working hard in school. And oh, that's beautiful. Look at this. Yeah, so the Catholic Church has been the most prominent church in France throughout its history. As you can imagine, with all the persecution of the Huguenots and various other religions. This is Abbé Pierre, a very famous priest who worked for peace and helped the homeless. This is Pentecost, some really cool costumes there. And beautiful Notre Dame, like probably the most famous cathedral face in the world. And you know, I got to visit because it was nice and cool inside. So we just went in and sat for like half an hour because it was maybe like 10 degrees cooler than it was outside. And we found a drinking fountain, and it had cold water, like about down there. And we were guzzling this water. And oh, I should have grabbed my tourist pictures because I took a picture of the drinking fountain. We were so thankful for it. Anyway, looks like he's having his bar mitzvah there, reading from the Torah and praying at the mosque here. And this is talking about the laws that are very discriminatory toward especially Muslim women wearing headscarves. This is by Renoir, very famous painter. You can tell Renoir, he did a lot of kind of flowers like this, and cute girls too, and pretty girls. But everything kind of had a very dreamlike thing about his artwork. It was all kind of pastel and blurred. Here's at the Louvre, the not the biggest museum, but it's definitely up there, which is the home of the Mona Lisa. This is by Degas. He painted a lot of ballerinas. That was his biggest muse. Ballet teachers, because I used to be a ballet teacher, we never did this anymore. Having a stick, because you would like bang out the rhythm, is not acceptable in ballet teaching today. The Arc de Triomphe. Very iconic structure, memorial. Edith Piaf, probably the most famous French singer. Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables. And here's the Lumiere Brothers inventing film. Thank you, Lumiere Brothers. Let's see, Jean Seberg, who was in a Jean-Luc Godard film, yeah. He's playing pétanque or boule, which is basically bocce ball but with less rules, so more fun, I think. Zinedine, the most famous soccer player from France by far, and he's from Algeria, so he's a hero for a lot of immigrants. And the Tour de France, the most famous bicycle race in the world. Oh, there, ice skating there. Looking very French about it, like, we are here ice skating, this is very fun, we are enjoying ourselves. Working hard in school again. And it looks like they're on their way to school. They're cute backpacks there. Playing escargot, a really cool hopscotch style game, but with higher stakes. It sounds fun. And having a brunch there. That's a very French picture too. Enjoying their day out here. There's a Vietnamese restaurant there too. And this is from the film Ratatouille. No, I'm kidding, it's not, but it looks like it, huh? Making some, what's it called? The melty cheese. I blank on the strangest words. Oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. The cheese you dip the bread in. You know what I'm talking about. I have blanked on the weirdest word. Oh, it's so close. Anyway, here's a delicious quiche. Like a cheese pie. I love quiche. Out at the cafe. Fondue. There it is. Fondue cheese. Thank you. My brain finally clicked. And he's making some croissants, some delicious pastries, and out shopping for some vegetables. And this is Bastille Day, a big, big parade down the Champs-Élysées. I think that's the end of the book, is it? It sure is. Okay. So that is the end of our video tonight. Like I said, I'll have a whispered video about France for you tomorrow, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good night.